Alrighty, folks, it is June of 2024, and it has been a while since we've talked about the CMMC assessment process guide, the CAP. We have not talked about that in quite some time, honestly. It hasn't been the forefront of all that many conversations. And, I played offensive line in high school for football, played left guard, was very good at it, played pulling guard, very good at it. And there was nothing that would infuriate our coaches more than false start penalties on the offensive line. I mean, I remember to this day just getting annihilated. There was one time they made us run halos with tires over our heads, crossfield halos at halftime while we were winning by 25 points because we were getting lazy and committing simple penalties. And, I think about what it was like for the other team who just getting absolutely dominated and then watching the other team get punished because they're not playing well enough. Texas football, everybody. Anyways, false starts are no fun. They're no fun to watch your team commit. They're no fun to commit yourself. Nothing good happens with false starts. And we all know that most companies in the ecosystem are straight up not ready for CMMC assessment. We know that based off DIBCAC assessment results. We know that based off of just the general kinds of questions that we get around the ecosystem at various events and things like that. It's an open secret. The majority of the ecosystem is not ready. However, I think that the total number of assessment failures is going to be very low because of the way that the CMMC assessment process is structured. If companies don't represent feasible assessments, then they aren't going to fail the assessment because they won't happen in the first place. Something that we are having this episode for, to coin a phrase known as a CMMC false start. And we're going to get into why we settled on that name and what the heck a feasibility assessment is in the first place.
So let's talk about false starts for a second. So you had to run halos at halftime. We won a game 53-0 one time. And in Maryland, the state of Maryland, there are these things called hurricanes, and they just happen to happen during football season. We had a practice the following day because we had 3 false start penalties. We had 15 100-yard gassers. And during that, in a hurricane, our coaches hit golf balls at us, practiced their swings with their wedges and their irons while we ran gassers. False starts are a terrible thing. I think that the term false start, which
child abuse is what it is.
It is, but back in the day, it was.
We could run the ball though. We could run the ball though.
we were tough. We didn't get another false start penalty for the rest of the year, especially that one guy that took one to the back of the dome. But listen to me here. False starts TM because we wanted to catch on, right? Or you wanted to catch on. Took off like wildfire. And I think that the way that this is going to happen, I agree with you. I think that it is going to stop, for the most part, failed assessments. Unless, and I always got to throw these little caveats into things. Unless there's a situation where this first process of the CMMC assessment process guide, and by the way, not you pulling the dust, you're going to the deep in the closet and dusting off the topics here for the show this week. But I think that it's going to go into the interpretation of the C3PAO, right? Because that is where this lies. This is an evaluation, a preset evaluation for the C3PAO. And they're going to have to evaluate whether or not is the documentation good enough to get you into the assessment, or do you think the documentation is good enough to lead you totally through the assessment, right? We're not saying that you pass this process and you get there and you pass the assessment, because there may be some C3PAOs that are like, well, it looks like that you have the proper documentation coverage. And I think that that's one key thing that's in here. They're not necessarily reading through and saying that this documentation is adequate and sufficient. 2 key words in the CMMC sphere, right? It's more so coverage. Is it there? Does it go into it? It's not going to then go in and test the implementations. There's no guarantee that everything well put together documentation could have terrible technical implementations on the back end. I think we're going to talk about that. Yep.
Yeah. So, it is very subjective. It is a judgment call, but maybe at the end we can talk about how we think it'll end up playing out. Anyways, CAP boilerplate. For a quick review, for all those of you who haven't taken your CCP yet, or it's been a while since you've taken the CCP, Like I said, it's been a long time since we've talked about this document. It was released in July of 2022 to a lot of fanfare because everyone was wondering where the heck the cap was back in those days. It is still in its initial draft form. It has not been revised. It is still the draft document. If you find the link below, it is still the draft cap. The Cyber AB took public comments on the draft cap, and we have seen nothing come of that. We have no idea what they're going to do with those comments or what the revision is going to actually look like. And they've said multiple times on multiple town halls that the updated cap, the final version of the cap, won't happen until after the CMMC 32 CFR rule is final. That's according to the AB. We expect that rule is probably going to be published by the end of 2024. So we're looking at the next revision of the cap, end of 2024, early 2025-ish. Nevertheless, all that out of the way, we still expect, I think it's probably safe to assume that the rough structure of the overall CMMC assessment phases and steps is going to remain mostly the same, right? And so just as a quick review, there are 4 phases in a CMMC assessment according to the draft cap. Phase 1 is plan and prepare for the assessment, which has 7 steps. It's the largest one. Phase 2 is conducting the assessment, which has 3 steps. Phase 3 is report and recommend assessment. Report recommended assessment results, which has 2 steps. And phase 4, close out any POAMs if they exist, and close out the assessment as necessary. Obviously, something like what the guidance is on closing out POAMs is dependent on what the final guidance is in the rule around what's POAMable, right? Okay, so just so everybody knows, CCP training, the overall training course is essentially just consists of understanding the cap in detail and understanding the CMMC assessment guide. So we've got the CMMC assessment process guide, the steps and phases of assessment, and then we've got the CMMC assessment guide, which is essentially the requirements in 171, the verification procedures in 171A, smushed together with some additional CMMC information in the discussion and things like that. Okay, so the assessment guide primarily makes up phase 2 of this cap. So you can sort of think of it as nested inside of the cap, right? Because actually conducting the assessment in phase 2 is done with the assessment guide, but there are other things that have to be done around the course of a CMMC assessment that form the overall process of a CMMC assessment. Quick question. The CMMC assessment process guide is the cap, but the CMMC assessment guide is not the CAG. Why don't we call it the CAG? Maybe that'll be a different episode, different poll in the future on LinkedIn, because we call one the cap, but not the other the CAG. Not very helpful. Anyways, we're really scraping the bottom of the barrel here, folks. Moving on. So we're not going to walk through every step and phase and sub-step in the cap because we're not doing a CCP course in this episode, but let us know in the comments if you would like us to go into more detail in these various steps and phases in future episodes. We have no problem with that. Today, we're focusing on the last step of phase 1. So step 1.7 is verify readiness to conduct the assessment. Verify readiness to conduct an assessment. And there's 2 sub-steps here under this final step. 1.7.1, access and verify evidence, and 1.7.2, make an assessment feasibility determination. So this is the last thing that happens before conducting the assessment itself, right? So the cap says the final step of phase 1 is to confirm that all parties are ready and positioned to conduct the CMMC assessment. This includes ensuring that the OSC is adequately prepared, the C3PAO assessment team is established and ready, that evidence is available and accessible, and that risks have been identified, all of which contribute to the overall feasibility of conducting the assessment as planned. Makes perfect sense. That's really not anything too crazy, except for that part about verifying that evidence is available and accessible. You have to know that the evidence is available before the assessment actually starts. Otherwise, everyone's wasting their time, right? So the cap goes on and they say the readiness review is not intended, this is what you were saying earlier, the readiness review is not intended to be a comprehensive determination of whether an OSC will necessarily meet any targeted CMMC level 1, level 2, level 3, whatever it happens to be, and be successful in obtaining a certification. Rather, the readiness review is the process of confirming that both parties are sufficiently prepared to conduct the assessment. Upon analyzing all of the information collected and discussions conducted during phase one, the lead assessor shall arrive at one of the following 4 possible determinations. So we're collecting this evidence, we're mapping this evidence to the various assessment objectives, we're collecting all of it together, we're getting the plan, we're getting the timeline, we're getting the resources, we're getting the roles, we're getting the points of contact, we're getting everything set up, we're reviewing everything that needs to happen, and then ultimately the lead assessor needs to make a decision. And they're going to say one of 4 things. Either we're going to proceed with the assessment as planned, green light. We're going to replan the assessment, yellow light. We're going to reschedule the assessment, yellower light. Or we're going to cancel the assessment, big, bright red light. We're not running the assessment because it's not feasible to run the assessment itself. So what are the sub-steps that are involved here? How do they actually arrive at these decisions? So there's 2 sub-steps here, right? There's 1.7.1 and 1.7.2. So under 1.7.1, access and verify evidence, this is what the cap says. They say in this step, the lead assessor and or assessment team members are obtaining evidence and confirming that it is present, accessible, and available to satisfy the requirement to assess evidence for CMMC certifications in phase 2. At no time during this preliminary review of evidence shall the assessment team provide any advice or recommendations on how the OSC could improve or enhance the sufficiency or adequacy of their presented evidence, right? They're simply making sure that there is enough evidence available, right? There is a coherent amount of evidence. Everything is passing the smell test so that when we start to conduct this assessment, we're just not, wrong, missing, fail. And then we've spent all this time and money for essentially no result other than saying that everything is not met. Yes, Jason, good question.
Raises his hand. First question in the class. So Jacob, if I were, an OSC, or even if I were an assessor, right, would there be some sort of document that would let me know that for maybe a particular control, if I were to look at an area that pertains to that control in that document, it would tell me that there are certain things, like certain pieces of evidence that may be potentially tested or evaluated, examined as a part of my evaluation process, that I would kind of want to make sure that they're present, right? Would there be a document?
Nope, there's no such document. Yeah, of course. Of course there's yes, of course. Go on.
Awkward silence. Yeah, so that I think that's what I'm saying, is that like there's a whole comprehensive way to look at this, right? We have had conversations on the most recent episodes that we've had.
Sorry, I should clarify. Theoretically, there is such a document because you couldn't have calculated an SPRS score and conducted a self-assessment under DFAR 7019 7020 if you didn't have such a document.
Well, this is also true. There's also the suggested evidence that appears in the assessment guides and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. The things that the assessor would potentially look at. Those would be the things that I would look at to guide me. But I think the best way to kind of explain what we are talking about here today with the readiness determination and assessment like that is, in the past couple episodes, we've talked about the need for documentation, and when we discussed NFOs and things like that. And you come to these assessment objectives within 800-171 that say things like define, right? Like you have to define something at some point. They're not going to be looking in this part of your CAP process, in this part of your assessment process, to see if you've defined the activity lockout period, right? But right. They're looking to see if the document exists that they should have to look for as a part of evidence that's there, and potentially if there is enough coverage there. They're not looking to see in depth the granular details of your operations to make sure that the control is successfully
implemented. For instance, if you say that screen lockouts happen after 15 minutes of inactivity, right? Correct. They're not going in and this stage of the assessment and saying, show me that the screen lockout setting is set to 15 minutes, right? That's not the level of detail that they're looking at. What they're really asking you is, there's a lot of documentation that we're going to have to verify here that is going to trigger what test questions we're going to ask. Do you have that documentation? And if you go, yeah, it's around here somewhere, they're probably going to reschedule or replan your assessment. And if you look at them and you go, we need documentation, then they're probably going to just cancel the assessment straight up, right?
Yeah, at some point in the process, one of these documents that's listed in this little block in the assessment guide is going to be something that you're going to have to produce to show us that you do these things.
We hear this a lot from people that we know who are at C3PAOs, and people will call them and say, hey, I'd like to get in the queue for a CMMC assessment. And they're like, okay, cool, just some couple questions. This is not an evaluation of the quality or content of your SSP, for example. But if you say, yeah, we've got an SSP and it's 5 pages long, there's no minimum length of an SSP, but it's extremely unlikely that your SSP is going to be providing any sort of value during an assessment for external people unfamiliar with your environment if it's 5 pages long, right? It's going to be longer than that. It doesn't have to be 500 pages long, but you're talking about a description of your entire control environment inside your business. And even if that's a 25-person organization, that's still a relatively sizable document for somebody to be able to look through and explain in a narrative what's going on here, right? It has to be longer than 5 pages. It's not feasible for anybody to conduct an assessment if your SSP is 5 pages and you don't have any policies, right? It's just, like it or not, it's just not going to be a thing it's just not going to work.
Absolutely.
So that gets into the next sub-step here, 1.7.2, make an assessment feasibility determination. This is sort of the final check here, the final green light, red light, yellow light that we need to go through. And the cap says, based on the verified existence of evidence, does it exist? We have verified that it exists. Along with the aforementioned resource estimates, assessment objectives, plans, and schedule, the lead assessor shall determine if conducting the assessment as framed is feasible. The lead assessor makes his or her assessment feasibility determination known to the OSC and the C3PAO and documents the recommendations in writing. Important note here, the C3PAO organization, the people who the assessors work for, they retain the ultimate decision authority on whether or not to proceed with the assessment. In the event that the C3PAO elects to either replan or reschedule the assessment, the C3PAO and the OSC should agree upon the specified way forward, make arrangements accordingly to resume the engagement at a future date, pretty standard. They also say here, under no circumstances shall the C3PAO offer any advice, implementation assistance, or recommendations as to how the OSC can improve or enhance their preparedness for a replanned or rescheduled CMMC assessment. And doing so is an explicit violation of the CMMC Code of Professional Conduct, right? This is not a evaluation of the evidence. It's verification that it exists. And if it doesn't exist, the assessment is not feasible. And they say if the C3PAO or the OSC decides to cancel the assessment, both parties should settle all affairs, including the return of any OSC proprietary information, and formally close out the engagement. How this works in terms of the money that you paid, how this works in terms of where your spot is in line, how this works in terms of whether you're going to continue on with this OSC in the future. Nobody knows, right? Because it's between you and the C3PAO, you, the OSC, and the assessment organization that you have partnered with here. I think that the majority of companies are dramatically underestimating the level of documentation and the level of evidence that's required to verify that these things are actually there. Now, theoretically, that shouldn't be the case because people have been uploading their assessment scores to SPRS. And if you calculated an assessment score, you did it with 171A, and the way that you verified 171A was based off of evidence that you reviewed. And so the same evidence should be used here. So there really shouldn't be any sort of a gap, but I think we all know that that's likely not true. And so instead of a bunch of people going into an assessment and then just getting stomped and failing everything, I think most people are going to get stuck in replan, reschedule, cancel hell, and they're not going to fail an assessment. They're just going to live in this weird interim space where we're scheduled for it, but it got rescheduled. We're scheduled for it, but we're going with a different C3PAO, and you're just hemming and hawing and having to explain to your customer why you were planning on originally getting your assessment 12 months ago and you still haven't gotten it yet, and you can't really explain why. So what are we going to call this phenomenon, right? So we're not failing assessments, but there's something else happening in terms of this feasibility step. So I took it upon myself to, as I often do, create a LinkedIn poll, and I asked people. I said, what term should we use when companies fail to pass assessment feasibility determination and thus do not qualify for a CMMC assessment? Should we call them phantom failures because all these people they're not failing the assessment, but they're not failing either? Should we call them shadow failures in the sense that we can't statistically account for why companies aren't receiving CMMC certifications because they're not outright failing, but they're not making it over the hurdle? Should we call them false starts because we thought we knew the snap count, and now there's flags all over the field and things aren't working? Or banana? The banana contingent is always a powerful contingent in these polls. 66% of people, 156 out of the 235 respondents, said that we should call this phenomenon a false start, a CMMC false start, a phase one false start, feasibility false start, something along those lines, as calling it a false start. So this episode is like a flag. We're planting a flag here for this term because I am very confident that this is going to be a problem when CMMC assessments begin. There's probably going to be congressional testimony about the status of the program, and they're going to go, oh, people are super pissed about what's going on and it's really difficult. And DoD is going to get up there and say, well, everybody who qualifies for an assessment passes the assessment 85-90% of the time because they are a feasible assessment. People who don't qualify for an assessment aren't technically failing, so that's not technically our problem is how I predict that that's going to play out.
So I did have a huge question about the monetary exchange, what goes in there, and one of the major parts about the first. This is step 1.7. Is this feasibility determination? 1 through 1 and 1 through 6 have things to do with getting the affairs in order to include the contractual, and it emphasizes the importance of contracts and billing milestones and things of that nature within the CAP itself and within the CMC, CCP training and the CAP itself. I think that with your poll, the terms phantom and shadow failures didn't do well because they have negative connotation attached to them, right? You've put failures in the word. And it's not necessarily a failure. It's just
it's not a failure. You just didn't pass.
Yeah, it's not even a pass because there's no determination. It's not an end game. It's just like, you're just not ready to go. Like I wish that I had the best analogy to attach to this, like a really funny one. But the fact of the matter is that like it's that commercial where they have the little dollar bill or whatever, and you thought you had it, and they keep pulling the dollar bill, and the little old man's laughing. Yeah, that's kind of it. Like you go to the C3PAO and you got your packet, and they're like, oh,
yeah, I mean,
thought you were close.
I mean, to me, the fishing commercial example, kids at home, ask your parents what a commercial is. The fishing commercial thing implies that there's some sort of gotcha thing going on here, right? It's very clear whenever you look at the assessment.
That's also true.
The assessment guide and the assessment process guide. You're going to need evidence in order to prove that these things are implemented. You need it to prove to yourself that these things were implemented. So just show the assessor the evidence that you used to calculate your own SPRS score. I think that that's not what occurred in many of the cases. I think a lot of SPRS scores were calculated, with some fuzzy math. And so as a result, then people are going to be very surprised whenever they go through the first few steps of the first phase of a CMMC assessment, and the C3PA goes, you're not a feasible assessment. We can't continue here. And to your point that you brought up earlier in the beginning of the episode, I think that more C3PAOs than not are going to opt to give people false starts rather than go into the formal assessment, because no C3PAO in their right mind is going to knowingly take on a company that they know is going to fail and then issue a failure at the end of the assessment, because they're going to get sued, right? This is America. We're going to sue people when we get a result from this assessment that we don't like, especially if it causes you to lose out on the ability to work with the DoD because you don't have the certification, right? So these C3POs are going to be extremely cautious, where they're going to say, you need to represent a very feasible assessment before we're going to take your money, before we're going to agree to go through the assessment at all. Because if you're just going to straight up fail, like we're not going to put ourselves at risk because you don't like what is inevitably going to be a bunch of not met results. and you're not going to get your CMMC certification.
And then, so for the record, like, regardless of what we've said in the episode, I think personally that this is a great thing to have in place, right? That this stops kind of like that high anxiety moment where organization is putting a lot of money on the table to maintain their contracts, and then just hoping that they go in and they've nailed this, in some cases, completely foreign process down to a T, to the point to pass an assessor's liking, especially the first time through.
And
I
it's
think
another one of
that's
those things. It's just another reason why the certification will end up differentiating companies that have it from companies that don't, because companies that have been sleeping on the process, they think it's not real, they think it's fake, they thought that it stopped in 2020, right? It's just going to take a very long time for them to get caught up. And a lot of the companies out there that other people, probably the people listening to this podcast, compete with, are underestimating what the process is like. They're probably not going to represent feasible assessments. And so you're just going to pull further and further ahead of your competition whenever this process plays out. But just to, pardon the pun, sum it up here, it's difficult to pass the CMMC.
You got to yell through the door and tell them to hit the horns.
It is difficult to pass a CMMC assessment, but it is not impossible to pass a CMMC assessment. But instead of focusing on the difficulty of passing an assessment, remember, it's also not the simplest thing to qualify for a CMMC assessment, right? You have to be ready to go for your assessment prior to the assessment beginning with these phase 1 steps and sub-steps. This is not simply a matter of writing a check to a C3 PAO and then just seeing what happens, right? I feel like what's going to happen is people are going to write a check to a C3 PAO, and there's going to be some language, because the C3 PAO is not going to do all this phase 1 verification for free, right? They're not going to just spend hours of time getting ready for the assessment and then saying, well, no harm, no foul, we'll just keep going, because most companies probably aren't going to make it out of phase 1, and the C3 PAOs are going to go broke if they did that work for free. So it's not just a matter of writing a check and seeing what happens. You're going to have to prove that the evidence exists. You're going to have convincing documentation before the assessment begins. And if you want to know an idea of what decent, well-rounded documentation looks like, we recently did an episode deep diving into NIST policy and procedure controls. And so if you want an idea of what these look like under the hood in a lot of detail, check out those episodes. We will link them in the description below.
All right.
There you go.
Yeah. What do you think that? Do you think it's going to be a delayed release for the cap now that the rules are kind of coming into a final form?
I don't know. I mean, I don't see any reason why the overall phase and steps of the cap need to change based off of what's in the proposed rule, other than details around, these are the things that can be on a POAM, these are the things that can't. This is how long a POAM can last.
It has to be in place before 32 CFR goes final, right? Because then then CMMC assessments start, right?
I mean, theoretically, CMMC assessments are available at that point, but is the AB going to be ready? We don't know. We'll have to wait and see what they have going on. I don't feel like the cap is something that, there's a lot of things that could be improved about the cap, but I don't know if there's a lot of stuff that has to change about the cap based off of the proposed rule. So I don't think that.
Yeah, that's the other thing that I was thinking. If you think about the rule and the contents of the rule and then the elements of the cap, not a whole lot.
I mean, that was the theme after the rule came out, right? The rule came out right after Christmas in 2023, and the overall takeaway was there's not a lot of surprises in here. Right?
And then
there were a couple of things in there that I think were surprises to people, MSP certifications and things like that. But the overall set of requirements, how a process works, the levels, who's in charge, waivers,
and then they can convene like a tribal council of like ecosystem members, right? To go through and make adjustments to it, like behind closed doors, right? Wasn't there like a working group or something they put together?
Yeah, that's.
I'm just trying to put together like a timeline. Like maybe there is stuff in the background just because we don't see it physically on the surface right now. Like there's no reverse engineering of URLs that take us to updated release of the cap.
I'll put it this way. If people think that that's a thing, or if they have questions about it, they should attend the monthly AB town halls and ask them, because I'm going to keep my opinion to myself. That's how feasibility assessment determinations work in the draft cap as of today. We think that should be called a CMMC false start. That's what the majority of people, at least in our poll on LinkedIn, think that it should be called. What do you think it should be called? Let us know in the comments. But for now, it's going to be CMMC false start. See you in a year or two when that process starts to play out, and we get to say we coined the phrase.
Instead of yellow flags, CMMC false starts get purple flags.
We'll workshop that one. We'll see you guys next week.
See you next week.